Hi. Um, let's talk about the book that we read. Um, this book. This one. Um, First of all, I want to say I actually enjoyed most of it. There were bits where I got kind of lost. Um, this chapter, The Pursuit of Profit, Rousseauism on the Bourse. I don't know how to say that. I got kind of lost because he has a lot of financial language that I just didn't get. But other than that, I generally actually really enjoyed this. So I'm figuring the best way to do this is to go one by one through them, talk about what he talks about. So, the first chapter, The Case for the Enlightenment, George Washington's False Teeth, is about, first of all, he talks about how it's about deflation. So it's about bringing everything back into the actual Enlightenment proper instead of having a bunch of Enlightenments. And then second of all, he actually defends the Enlightenment proper. So the French Enlightenment with the philosophes, he defends it against the common attacks, um, which was interesting. I actually agreed with most of his defenses; they were good, but I think that he doesn't give a sufficient answer to a couple of them. I wrote about it in my paper just a tiny bit in one of the paragraphs. The next chapter, The News in Paris, this one was actually really interesting to me. Um, so the whole point of this one is that communication systems have always shaped events. So he's talking about this common assertion that the modern age is like more communicative than the rest of the ages of history, and he shows that in Paris in the 18th century there was a lot of communication just between everyone, um, and that's not a modern thing. So like he talked about how they used gossip and songs to spread the news. He has this nice fun chart for us that was very confusing, um, but it's yeah, he's basically just saying that like through songs and through gossip and through little novelettes or what does he call them? There's a name for them, but little tiny novels. They would spread the news, especially about the sex life of the kings and those in power throughout all of the Paris. That was really interesting. And if I can get to the next chapter, The Unity of Europe, Culture and Politeness. I found this one probably, well, this one and The Pursuit of Happiness, I think, were the most interesting ones to me. And so, what he talks about what he talks about, he starts off talking about currency in Europe and how that like has reshaped how they talked about it, like that they are sharing one currency. Um, but the rest of the thing is about how the Enlightenment thinkers had this cosmopolitan vision that they could unite the world around common values in their Republic of Letters, and that the actual physical boundary lines didn't have any say in the matter. They just shared their ideas with each other. Um, I also thought the thing about politeness was really interesting. It reminded me a lot of modern like political correctness, and I'm not one of the people who thinks that political correctness is like a vice. I think it's a good thing to use your brain whenever you're talking in public. But I think it was really interesting to see that kind of mindset of like how can I say this politely without offending anyone is pretty old. The one thing I did think was really interesting was that Christianity was considered unpolite. The next one, The Pursuit of Happiness, this one was really interesting as well. Um, he talked about the two different, like the French and the American views of the pursuit of happiness, or maybe you should just say Voltaire and Jefferson's views of the pursuit of happiness. Um, and he talked about the end of Candide, where the main character, whose name I'm forgetting, says, um, "We must tend our garden," and how that is like the idea of happiness for him, which is really interesting because when I read that book, I didn't read it the way that he's saying it should be read, that like tending your garden is symbolic of conquering civilization. He's probably right because he's studied these guys way, way more than I have. But just on a first read, that reads as the same thing that he says Thomas Jefferson is doing, where Thomas Jefferson is going to his garden. He's going to Monticello and just tending his garden, doing his work, staying out of the public eye until he was president, staying out of the public eye and just doing what he knows he has to do. Um, that was interesting to me to rethink the way that Voltaire thought about happiness versus how I read that in Candide when I actually read it. The individual and the social is what he calls them. So there's the going to your home and tending your garden, and then the going out and trying to conquer the world. The two modes of finding happiness. The Great Divide, Rousseau on the route to Vincennes. I don't know how to say that name. In this essay, he talked about how Rousseau had this like realization when he was on the road one day that he was living this double life of trying to pursue like salon culture and then trying to pursue how much he dislikes salon culture. And so he's living this double life, and so he had this realization at one point where that this was wrong and that he couldn't keep doing it. And in that, he kind of reformed some ideas. The end of this essay was really interesting, where he talks about symbolic forms of power. So that salon culture was a symbolic power move. That they had this like that the theater was symbolic power, whereas like outside, God, I got the hiccups. Outside games are symbolic of republicanism. I thought that was interesting because I think he's right. That was very fascinating. The Craze for America, Condorcet and Rousseau. This one was kind of interesting as well. So basically, he talks about how in France during the 18th century they had this obsession with America and what they were doing in America and like their rebellion. And he talks about how these French like use this influence of America to kind of idealize America, and said that like we need to be like America and France, and how that kind of influenced the French Revolution, and it influenced a bunch of French people moving to America. It says they equated America with the cause of humanity and the pursuit of happiness, which I thought was pretty interesting. It's a good summary of what that essay is about. The Pursuit of Profit, Rousseauism on the Bourse. Basically, this essay is about these two guys, Rousseau and Clavière, who worked together. Well, Rousseau worked for Clavière, I think. Yeah, Rousseau worked for Clavière. And they were. It's like a stock market. It's about the stock market, basically, in France. And what happened was they were trying to save, like, I think they were trying to short. This was the one that I got most confused by. They were trying to maybe short someone's thing, but they were fighting against like men in power in the government. And so what it ended up being was more of a political fight than a financial fight. He talks about how they were stock jobbing in the courts, and how Rousseau wrote these like pamphlets against them under a pseudonym to try and get the prices down, as far as I could understand. And what ended up happening was it became really political instead of just financial, because they were attacking men in power. The last essay, The Skeletons in the Closet, How Historians Play God, was also very interesting. He talked about in this essay that he did a bunch of research and found that Rousseau, who's like a big Girondist, I think, in the French Revolution, was more than likely a police spy during the old regime in France. And so he talks about how at the very end of this essay, he has a couple quotes that were really, really good. He talks about how historians play God when they're making these decisions, and he's saying Rousseau is guilty of this thing that he may have been guilty of. He probably was, but the thing is, it is like so complex, and that humans are complex. The coolest part of this is perhaps, however, the either or approach to biography is flawed. Perhaps life is a bundle of contradictions, and the attempt to impose consistency on it is wrong. Was Brissot both a dedicated and a crass spy for the police? God only knows. The historian knows, but imperfectly, through documents darkly, with help from hubris by playing God. That's the last couple sentences in the whole thing. Um, Fascinating. It's a good book. I enjoyed it. It's a short, easy read as well, most of the time, except for that one essay. Um, that's my best summary of it in 10 minutes.